Welcome to week 6 of Global Environmental Governance. This week we talked about science, epistemic communities, non-state actors, and transnational governance. We also finished up talking about a theme from last time when we were discussing the role of international environmental organizations and regimes. Last week, we discussed the issue of international environmental organizations and embedded that in the wider context of international regimes, organizations being entities with buildings and staff, international regimes being the wider complex of rules and institutions in a given issue area. We didn't get a chance to discuss Ronald Mitchell's piece on the oil pollution regime, which includes a number of different treaties. And he noted that between different approaches to oil pollution, there were very significant differences in the degrees of compliance. In the parts of the oil pollution regime that had discharge limits to limit the amount of pollution in and around tankers, very limited effectiveness, considerable ongoing pollution, and yet the later technological standards that emerged under the MARPOL Convention forced tanker owners to install items such as double hull tankers. That was much more effective, and he noted that had to do with the ease of monitoring, that it was very difficult for states to be able to keep track of violations of discharge limits, where it was much easier for states and sort of delegated private authorities like insurers, certifiers, and ports to be able to observe whether or not certain tankers had the appropriate equipment standards in place. This may not be a generalizable lesson that technological standards are a preferred option, but it gets at the idea of intentional institutional design to try to tailor the rules of particular international agreements around the nature of the problem and make sure that the institutions are fit for purpose and tailored again to the problem at hand. The next topic we discussed was the role of epistemic communities, or technical experts, scientific experts. And we discussed the work of Peter Haas and the Med Plan. And what these actors have in common is shared causal beliefs about the nature of the problem, and often follow on normative beliefs about what should be done. Embedded in this approach is this particular understanding of the role of science as a sort of neutral arbiter that's sort of separate from policy, where that goes off to develop consensual knowledge that's objective, then brings it back to the policy process later. And that may be a particular understanding of science that is a useful fiction, but the way the scientific process often unfolds is a more iterative, tightly coupled process that's maybe more responsive to policymakers and informed by policymakers' wishes. There may still be a process of the scientific method that works in the search and discovery of truth, but this notion of the scientific process being objective side area that's conducted outside the space of political influence may not be the reality in which it actually unfolds. There are boundary organizations like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or the CITES Secretariat that serve to translate scientific findings to policy audiences. And as we think about the specific efficacy of scientific contributions to the Med Plan example in the Peter Haas reading, we can reflect on why their efforts were so successful. And it may have to do with the nature of the problem, that it was a regional seas issue, that perhaps there weren't excessively high costs of trying to heed scientific advice. many of the scientists themselves were ultimately able to cross over and have positions of authority, which helped their ability to influence and shape the policy as it unfolded. Other issues may not enjoy those same benefits. The problems may be harder, more costly to resolve. There's more complexity, maybe more states involved. And so it's not a foregone conclusion that scientific expertise will always be listened to. And indeed, there are other considerations, normative, ethical ones, political considerations, other kinds of expertise like social science expertise that natural scientists may have limited expertise in and can't be adjudicated solely by natural science to provide all the answers. The next topic we discussed this week was the role of non-state actors, and these are private actors who are not governments or intergovernmental organizations. This can include scientists who don't work for governments, maybe who work for think tanks or private universities. They also include non-governmental organizations. They include private corporations. For-profit corporations are non-state actors. Also includes private foundations, can include labor groups, religious groups, also nasty non-state actors like terrorists or criminal networks. Those are also among the categories of non-state actors. The role of non-governmental organizations in this space is a really important one. There are some well-known international non-governmental organizations like Greenpeace, the World Wildlife Fund that do a lot of work in this space. There are others as well. These are distinguished from, say, intergovernmental organizations or IOs because they are not representatives of states. They are voluntary organizations, typically nonprofit. They're either funded by members or by philanthropic contributions. They might get some government grants, and there may be a variety of kinds that are sort of boundaries between NGOs and state actors. We talked about, states setting up government-organized non-governmental organizations, GONGOs, which may be something of a contradiction in terms. And there are other boundary organizations that maybe serve the interests of private actors who are interested in profit. So business and industrial group non-governmental organizations like trade associations, bingos. These non-governmental organizations may vary in size. So there are some that are quite small that just have a handful of members, and others are multi-million-dollar complex operations that operate in multiple countries. Environmental NGOs perform a variety of functions, and indeed there are some non-explicitly environmental organizations like Oxfam that have increasingly moved into the environmental space to shape issues that they care about. But as we think about the functions of environmental NGOs or NGOs broadly, they can have a variety of roles of issue framing and shaping understanding of issue areas and actually carrying out mass lobbying and pressure campaigns. They can also be more technical and develop knowledge and issue reports like those of the World Resources Institute. They can also play a more inside role of elite advocacy by trying to shape the opinion of decision makers directly through insider lobbying. They can also play a role which is akin to the scientific knowledge formation process, but do so more in the monitoring of state behavior and, again, issuing reports or more field-based efforts to assess what's going on. They can actually be service providers and implementers on the ground. So I use the example of the Wildlife Conservation Society, which is administering and managing a number of national parks, particularly on the African continent. They can also play a role of standard setters, so they can, and we'll talk more about this with the rise of private authority, like the Forest Stewardship Council, the Marine Stewardship Council. They can create new standards and rules in this space that may shape state behavior. The source of influence of non-governmental organizations comes from their ability to mobilize information to help decision makers understand the nature of issues, but also they are often seen as the legitimate authoritative voice of different interests on the ground, and they may in turn be able to mobilize people power through mass protest. And so their material influence may be limited, but their ability to mobilize information and people may give them any powers that they do possess. But because NGOs are not necessarily the decision makers themselves, there are limits on their ability to influence the policy process. And I would argue that they exercise more authority at the agenda setting stage once a policy's been taken up by governments and instituted. It's more difficult for non-governmental organizations to continue to influence the process, although they seek to do so through monitoring and naming and shaming. But again, they are ultimately dependent upon states' permissiveness and their ability to operate in different country contexts and their willingness to listen to them. And so there's variation between countries and between leaders on whether or not that they are interested in environmental issues at all. And ultimately, the relative power of non-governmental organizations in terms of material resources often pales in comparison to transnational, multinational corporations, and certainly states. We also talked about the role of transnational advocacy networks, drawing on the work of Margaret Keck and Catherine Sickink in their book, Activists Beyond Borders. Transnational advocacy networks are motivated by shared normative beliefs about a problem, and so actors come together across borders to make common cause together, which is a little different than epistemic communities, who are more brought together by shared causal beliefs about the world. Now, transnational advocacy networks can be semi-formal networks or more formal networks that have membership structures or informal information sharing groups like listservs. And transnational advocacy networks can also rely on allies in power in states or intergovernmental organizations. So there are a variety of groups that can be members of transnational advocacy networks, including civil society actors like environmental groups, religious groups, labor unions, and others. Keck and Sickink identify 4 different mechanisms or politics of influence, including information politics, mobilizing information, scientific studies, symbolic politics, which deals more with narrative and symbols and stories to evoke emotion and frame an issue area in a particular light. There are also leverage politics, where non-governmental actors intend to enlist more powerful actors on their side from states or intergovernmental organizations. And then accountability politics, of holding actors to account for their promises, to identify gaps between word and deed, to expose hypocrisy, and name and shame actors for failure to live up to their commitments. They also popularized the notion of the boomerang effect, where non-governmental actors, say in the global south, find their efforts to persuade their own governments blocked, so they reach out to transnational allies of NGOs in the global north to share information, and in turn enlist those actors in the global north to try to leverage more powerful actors in the global north on their behalf, like states or intergovernmental organizations. So this boomerang effect may bring pressure back to bear on the state. Keck and Sickink also explore what arguments are more likely to be persuasive and what target actors are more likely to be vulnerable to these pressures. They note that environmental issues are often contested, and that arguments framed around bodily harm to humans and equality of opportunity are more likely to be successful, particularly if the causal chains connecting a problem to a effect are short. I would note that environmental values have diffused more broadly internationally, and that harms to non-human species and landscapes have a history of getting support if actors frame arguments around charismatic megafauna, for example. But I think that these observations from Keck and Sickink from the late 1990s have some validity. In terms of target vulnerability, they note that some states are more susceptible to these pressures if they are weaker and reliant on other countries for material forms of support, such as foreign assistance or trade. And some other countries may be invulnerable to these pressures if they are somewhat autarkic and less well tied into the international community. They also note that actors, both individuals and states, trying to improve their reputations if they're coming in from, a period of authoritarian government to democracy, or in other historical junctures, may find themselves seeking more reputational approval of the international community and be particularly vulnerable to these pressures. We also talked about a particular kind of advocacy known as direct enforcement, and this is a technique adopted by some small environmental groups like Sea Shepherd Society, where they seek to raise the cost of environmentally destructive behavior by interdicting whaling and fishing ships, by cutting nets, and exposing law-breaking behavior by those bad actors. This is different from traditional kinds of advocacy, which is often intended to rally a wider public in support of their agenda. This is more narrowly focused on raising the costs of environmentally destructive behavior. It may have a wider audience of trying to encourage states to enforce the laws, since these groups are saying nobody's enforcing these laws, so we will do it. But the fact that they are focusing their activity around perceived lawbreaking and their efforts to enforce the law insulates themselves from the kinds of pushback or repercussions of their actions, because they can essentially say, we're doing actions that you should be doing. And some of their activities may be tolerated by states who are happy to let them expose and try to stop these law-breaking activities. This might be a technique that smaller groups that lack the resources to influence wider public opinion might adopt. Now, I would note that the Sea Shepherd Society ended up having a documentary series about them, Whale Wars on Animal Planet, so they actually might be trying to enlist the wider public in support of their cause, even though this particular article suggests that their primary form of activity is around raising the costs of law-breaking by environmental malefactors. The last topic that we discussed is the role of private authority, which is efforts by private actors, either companies or certifying agencies or other organizations, to build rules and norms and standards in this space. And Jessica Green talks about two different kinds of private authority, some that are delegated by states and some that is entrepreneurial activity where private actors are filling a void left by states. So in terms of delegated authority, she gives examples such as traffic, which on behalf of states carries out monitoring and enforcement activities related to wildlife protection. And in terms of an entrepreneurial authority, there are examples such as the Forest Stewardship Council or the Marine Stewardship Council, or efforts by Walmart, for example, to build more robust, environmentally sound supply chains. The delegated authority expands the reach of states, and they do so on purpose. Entrepreneurial authority may emerge in instances in which states fail to agree, for example, on a treaty-based arrangement, and therefore private actors may step into the breach and try and create rules and norms when states are unwilling to do so. This form of private authority emerged in the 1990s at a time when treaty-based mechanisms, like in the forest space, were contested and not going anywhere. This may have been a preferred strategy for environmental groups who found the adversarial approach vis-a-vis private companies to be difficult to sustain over time. So in the late 1980s, there were environmental groups that would protest against, say, Home Depot's sourcing of timber. They would abseil off the roof of Home Depot stores and try to name and shame them. The private authority is a more consensual approach of trying to enlist private actors in support of an environmental agenda. In terms of, do they work or not? Well, it's a relatively recent phenomenon. Many of the organizations that work in this space only have a small share of the market. There are sometimes efforts by private companies to establish rival certification systems that have less onerous standards, and so there's a risk of greenwashing and confusion for publics. And if it only is catering to a small segment of the market, it may have less influence than it otherwise might. And there may be some selection bias so that the kinds of companies that end up joining these initiatives are from the global north, and it may not be expansive to include all the companies in the global south. So these private certification systems and others may not be substitutes for treaty-based mechanisms. The delegated authority systems in which states delegate to private actors to carry these out on their behalf may work rather better. But on some level, these are pretty new instruments, and it may be too soon to tell, and some may work better than others.